does Newgrange mean to you?
Newgrange is symbolic. It's a symbolic thing. It's a monument, but it's a monument to many things. It's a monument primarily to the people of Neolithic Ireland, who laboured long and hard under very difficult conditions to enshrine their spiritual beliefs and their religious practices and their beliefs around death and as it were the afterlife monumentally and immortally in stone. It's a fabulous testament to a people who lived very short lives and who had to endure a lot of hardships. And it's a symbol to me of the longevity of the everlasting nature of human ingenuity and the indomitable human spirit which fights against all of the things that life throws at it. And it's a great shrine to all of those things and more. And today it's come to represent for a lot of people a symbol for them of aspects of their own Irish or Celtic heritage that they consider to be unique to us as a people.
And when I started out investing into Newgrange specifically for this documentary, it was because in some way I felt uncertain with my own life and I suppose a bit lost in a way. Do you think it's normal for people when they feel like this to turn to their history, or would you think that's quite strange that you would look somewhere else?
No, I think that what we probably don't recognise too fully or too readily or too implicitly in this day and age is the fact that our mythical heritage, and I'm talking about humanity in general, not just Irish people, our mythical heritage traditionally has been something that has rooted us. It's been fabulously important to us. So it is the foundation of your race, as it were, your tribe, your people. It provides a cultural backdrop and a foundation upon which your cultural identity or your national identity is built. So I don't think it's at all surprising when there's a spiritual or a religious vacuum, as I think there is in modern Ireland right now, for people to return to those things. It is what we have always done. It's just that because of first of all, because of the migratory nature of humans, that a lot of people are now living far from their traditional ancestral homelands. So, for instance, a lot of white European descendants are now living in the United States, just to take one example. Here in Ireland, I personally consider myself very lucky to be able to connect with those things and to be close to not just the monuments, which are, I suppose, symbols of that, but to actually connect with the landscape itself, which is an important aspect of it. And through that exploration, my own exploration, I have found that the mythology kind of seeps through anyway, that it begins to make sense. Things that you've read and things that you've kind of encountered on your journey and things that you learned at school about simple things like the salmon of knowledge, all of these stories eventually have a meaning that permeates into your everyday life,
Yeah, now when you're speaking about mythology there, when I spoke to Brendan Matthews, he said that our history is everything in Ireland is almost turned into a fairy tale and that we don't take it seriously because of that. But is our mythology not our culture in some sense. Is that not what makes us who we are?
Well, yeah, but I think that's actually what I was just saying there previously. Mythology is a sort of a language of a race, in a way. It's the story of a race. So, from a psychological standpoint, the likes of Joseph Campbell and Carl Jung would have believed that mythology was intensely important to the integrity of a community or a tribe or a nation or a culture, and that it was integral to to the mental and indeed physical well-being of people. So Brendan's point is very interesting because he's right. However, mythology, and this is the double-edged sword for the student of mythology, is never ever take it as a historical account, but also never dismiss it as mere fable, because it's somewhere between the two.
So what would be the mythology then behind Newgrange?
Oh, where do you start? Well, the mythology of Newgrange, first and foremost, is that it was built by the Tuatha Dé Danann, who were prehistoric deities. I mean, they weren't human. They were something else. They were the ancient invasion myths chronicle a series of invasions of Ireland or arrivals, starting with the granddaughter of Noah, which is obviously a biblical tie-in. But the Tuatha Dé Danann arrive from the sky, and when they arrive in Ireland, they burn their ships because they don't want to have to escape through cowardice. So they want to face whatever enemy might be here. So they are the ones that are associated with constructing Newgrange. The Dagda, who's the chief supreme deity, is the one who is said to have built it, and his son Angus later takes over. So it is immediately associated in the mythology with the supreme beings, the ones that are, I suppose, closest to our hearts in a sympathetic way, in a nostalgic way. The first port of call for somebody who's getting in touch with mythology and who wants something ancient to identify with seems to be the Tuatha Dé Danann. And then, in addition to that, they are places that are associated with the arrival of the sun. First of all, that's very important, and the yearly round of the sun. So we know that with Newgrange because we see it happening at winter solstice, and by extension associated with the growing of crops and the turning of the seasons, which is very important to Neolithic culture, the people who originally built it. And then, as a sort of a symbol of status, they are designed, I think, as everlasting monuments. They're designed to be there forever. They weren't fleeting things. They were structures that were put there by a community that recognized its own very fragile human nature and the brevity of its existence, and decided, well, we need an expression of permanence in this very impermanent life. But I mean, there are dozens and dozens of myths connected with Newgrange. Specifically seems to be the centerpiece, you know.
Do you think, because I don't personally see people telling stories anymore in Ireland, like I don't really hear of people being sitting around telling stories of mythology kind of isn't really passed down anymore. Like, for example, my younger brother, he probably doesn't know one myth, which I find quite funny. I know a few because of the age that I am, although I probably don't know a lot. Do you think it's having, I wouldn't say have an effect on people, but do you think it's, like, I suppose, taking away from our culture that this is kind of being left behind, like the fact of telling a story? Undoubtedly. And as I said previously, and this was a belief of C.G. Jung, who was one of the great minds of the 20th century, and was a great, I suppose, a great believer in the importance of myth to the human story. And that is that if you become divorced from your story, the thing is that
there is an innate need with humans for story. We sometimes don't recognize that. Today, some people, and it's only some people, because a lot of us are sensitive to, these things. I think I am. But some people are so rational and so almost post-scientific that they won't consider for a second their spiritual needs. So these are people who are atheistic, who don't go to church, who don't believe in any god or deity, and who maybe they might take a run or a walk in the countryside and not recognize that that is a spiritual experience for them. So Jung believed that a nation or a culture that became detached from its myths and its stories was in danger of, at the very least, deterioration, and at its worst, catastrophe. And in a very good biography of Jung by Lawrence van der Post talks about the situation in Germany and the detachment there from especially mythology relating to the divine feminine characters, or the feminine aspect, which Jung concentrated on quite a lot. So I think it is a national tragedy to allow it to. And by the way, when I was your age, I was in the same boat. I only knew a few myths, and so my learning hasn't unfortunately come from the indigenous passing on of tribal lore from mouth to mouth, from parent to child, as it was for centuries, and in fact I believe for thousands of years. My learning has been through books. And I think that's unfortunate in one respect, but the other aspect of it, and this is where there is much hope, is that you can, I believe, resuscitate and revive very wholeheartedly the ancient stories, and in addition to that, make them relevant to the modern world.
Yeah. And just coming back then to Newgrange itself, in your own personal opinion, do you believe that all the time that these people spend building this monument, and the time and effort and the longevity that went into this monument, was just for the purpose of burying a few bodies in it?
Oh, the old nugget. That's that's a very commonplace question, and I think the reason for that is because there's been a lot of controversy around the designation of these sites with the label Passage Tomb. Now, I've written about this in my Newgrange book, and I'm philosophical about it. I don't take sides too vehemently, but I'll summarise it as quickly as possible. The term Passage Tomb is inadequate to describe Newgrange, but in the arsenal of material evidence possessed by the archaeological community, in their view, the principal function of these sites was connected with death, and they call them houses of the dead, etc., etc. Now, I extend that. You cannot deny the evidence, and the evidence is that yes, there are a lot of mostly cremated and some uncremated remains in these places, so you can't deny that that's an aspect of them. Now, if you go back to the literature and the mythology refers to those sites as she, which is an old Irish word, S-I-D fada, H-E, pronounced she, and that is a word which doesn't, in my opinion, and that's only my opinion, it doesn't have an adequate translation into English. It's long been translated as a fairy mound or an otherworld mound. Now, to me, even that is closer to the truth. Otherworld mound, in other words, a place that allows access to other realms. Now, why would you go to the lengths of building those things and performing the elaborate rituals around the dismemberment and destruction of the body? Because look, that's what happened. The body's torn apart, and somebody had to do that and burnt. And then when the burning was finished, the remains had to be taken out of the pyre when everything had cooled down. They were washed before being brought into the chambers and placed in ceremonial bowls. So there are elaborate rituals around the death of people. Why would you do all that unless you had some belief, that there was something else beyond all of this, which is at the root of, I believe, human religion. And I want to differentiate between spirituality and religion, because you can be spiritual without being religious. But why would you do that except for that they believed? And that belief is encapsulated by that translation of the word she, otherworld, mound. In the mythology, the she offer the gods, the Tuatha Dé Danann, the means to migrate between this world and an other world, which is known under various titles in the mythology. Tír na nÓg, the land of youth; Tír Tairngre, the land of promise; Magmel, the plain of happiness, all that stuff. And so I don't consider Newgrange as a place where you go to die. I consider it a place where people went to be reborn into another life.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
That's why I called my book Newgrange, Monument to Immortality. The immortality of the soul and the belief that you went on to something else. Whether that's another corporeal human life or an existence in a spiritual, in some sort of a heavenly realm.
So, in some, I question a lot that kind of my own spirituality or my own faith, because I personally myself don't have a religion. And looking at somewhere like Newgrange and hearing these, you say stuff like that and hearing stuff about Newgrange, it almost kind of gives you hope in a way that they're these people did all this for, obviously, to go on to the next life, for life after death more so. So it kind of gives you that kind of feeling of, well, trust in your ancestors, because they left this monument here to kind of, it's almost as if they left it here, so I'll repeat that. It's almost as if they left it here so we would know now that this isn't it. I don't know, that's the way I kind of would think of it like that. Yeah.
So, in other words, they weren't building it purely as a memorial to themselves and their time. They were building it as a lasting memorial to those beliefs. And look, this discussion is at the root, I believe, of every human spiritual experience, every human experience around the thought of death. It's the biggest question of human life. It's the single biggest thing that preoccupies us, whether that's consciously or unconsciously. Where do we go when we die? What happens to us? Is there something else? Where are my grandparents? Where are those beloved people that used to be in my life that died? Where are they? Are they just in a hole in the ground? Or and the answer to that is very different for every person. Well, it's quite different for every person. And the thing is, it changes. It changes. I mean, my own view has changed drastically from when I was young, and I'm far from reaching any conclusion about it. Actually, I'm less sure about anything now than I ever was, but ironically, much more comfortable about the whole thing than I've ever been, because I've kind of learned to, and this is essential as part of the immersion into your mythical history, is that, and I think that's partly what has helped me actually to this moment of realization. And the realization is, I don't know anything. I actually don't. I have a bloody clue what happens. Instinctively, I'm inclined to think, no, there is. I know 4 people, for instance, who've had near-death experiences, for whom the idea of their actual death is not something to be feared at all. Having died and come back to life, all of these people now have no fear of death. So that's fascinating, first of all, stuff like that, And then, I mean, I don't know how many of your listeners and people in general have had experiences in life that they cannot hope to explain rationally. And okay, it's like, if you can't explain something rationally about Newgrange, you just say it was built by aliens. it doesn't mean your recourse immediately should be to supernatural and to fantastic beliefs. But for me, the journey has been an interesting one, and I believe this is the journey that people in prehistory were very close to, and that is the idea of what the hell happens to us when we reach the moment of our physical death. And I actually believe that the afterlife wasn't just something like, for us, heaven, we've put it above the clouds, traditionally, when we were young, and especially a generation or two ago, when people still had faith in Christianity. When you were young, you pictured heaven as being a nice, bright place in the sky above the clouds with a big man on a throne and a beard and all the rest. But I believe in prehistoric times, for people, the whole idea of heaven or another world was permanently close at hand. In fact, the idea of the she is almost like some sort of a semi-transparent doorway between this and the other world. That the other world, in Irish mythical terms, can become present in this one on a whim, at the call of a bird or the descent of a mist into a valley. Suddenly you're in another world. And part of that is, of course, the experience of nature and the proximity of nature and the closeness of Neolithic culture to nature at a time long, long before we had any of our modern industrialised towns and cities and motorised transport and mechanised agriculture, any of that. And of course, one of the biggest things that we did in the time between then and now is to build permanent roofs over our heads and to introduce artificial lighting at night. So we've just blanked out the cosmos. So it's much further away than it has ever been.
So I'm going to go to the winter solstice on the 21st. And something that stuck with me is when I told my friends about the winter solstice and that I was going to go, they kind of laughed at me in a way. And I find that a lot of people, especially my age and younger, they kind of laugh at the idea of wanting to connect with nature or to connect with the sun or to just feel like you're here, like to feel a part of something.
Mm-hmm.
And then I suppose at the end of the day, like if it rains a lot in Ireland, and then the minute the sun comes out, it like completely changes everyone's mood. Like everyone just goes from this, they just become this really happy person. Why do you think people are afraid to kind of express that want, or even just to admit the fact that maybe like connecting to nature and connecting to the sun, like what kind of Newgrange helps you do, is such a bad thing?
Well, I think there's two reasons for it. One of them is the sort of derogatory view of religion and spirituality as if the two things are mutually, as if the two things are the same, which they aren't. Religion for me is the practice of ritual around spiritual beliefs, which involves a community, which involves a tribe, which involves a specific following of patterns, which to me is basically saying that your own personal spirituality has become redundant in a sense because you're part of a collective. Whereas for me, spirituality is a much more personal thing, and it's your relationship to whatever that is. In some cases that might just be being outdoors and being in nature. It might be your own personal belief in, well, maybe you believe in reincarnation, maybe you believe in the Christian heaven but you don't believe in the Christian hell. There's lots of different things that people can believe in. I think there's a tendency today to have a derogatory view of these things because they're all lumped in together, and of course because of the falling away of Christian belief in Ireland, and that is related mainly to scandals and mainly to things that happened that really shouldn't have happened, and people now connect everything to do with spirituality with all of this. And of course science continues to try, I think the way it's portrayed, it's like, in every new scientific discovery, it's like we're trying to kill God and we're trying to kill spirituality. I see the two things as being mutually beneficial, actually. But the other reason, there were two reasons. So the first one was that people have a derogatory view in general of spirituality. But the second one, and this is very important, it's because people are actually divorced from the natural world. So they have to see the sun shining in the window to their office or their house, where they've become basically a slave to a life, where they're either tied to a desk or they're tied to something. And a huge number of people work indoors now in artificially lit offices and spaces where there is no great view of nature. There's no view of the sky. There's no sound of the birds. There's no proximity to the wells and the streams and the rivers and the fields and the hills and the forests, which was part of the human experience for millions of, certainly a couple of million years, however far back we go. So the fact that people are divorced from that, then it's no surprise then that there's a slightly derogatory view of it, because it's like, well, what is that? What nature and spirituality are seen as the one and the same for some people. Well, then ask these people, what is it about going to the beach on a sunny day that uplifts them? And what are the things that they actually consciously think about while they're there? That's an interesting exercise for people. I tell you now, on a really good day in Ireland, when people hit the beach, they're thinking things like, wouldn't it be great if it was like this all the time? And wouldn't it be great not to be stuck in work? And wouldn't it be great to be able to enjoy this? That is the sort of thing that I believe humans in previous generations were able to do, because whatever work they were doing, of course, don't forget, look, the domestic aspect of the human experience has only recently become convenienced by the introduction of, washing machines and running water and all that sort of stuff, and electricity, stuff we didn't have in previous generations. But your work and your domestic work were basically probably one and the same thing up to probably about a century ago. And I mean, actually before the famine in Ireland, the holdings were small holdings, so your farm was basically to feed you and your family, whereas today it's all very intense, and farmers are selling grain and crops and milk for dairies, and huge amounts of them. And I wonder actually how many people one field of grain in Ireland, like 3 acres of grain, actually feeds. How many litres of milk do we get from a 200 cow herd down in Cork? That sort of stuff. But I'm getting away from the point. The point was that in people's everyday lives now, first of all, they've moved away from religion, and they connect that with spirituality. They think the two things are related, so they don't see their need for a spiritual experience. So I believe that the human being has an innate need for spiritual experience, numismatic experience, uplifting experiences. The fact that for even the most unreligious people, and people who don't care one way or the other, that a nice sunny day can make them feel uplifted is very interesting in itself, Yeah,
it really is. Because, like, in some way, when I even myself go out for a walk, or like I live in Bettystown and I live on the doorstep of the beach is on my doorstep, and there's a lot of places I can go around Bettystown for a nice walk, whether like it's across the beach, it's through fields, it's nice scenery, and while you're walking, it's like you almost feel, it's like it can take stress away from you, I find, in with busy lives, like everyone has busy lives these days, and like especially like with myself, like I'm working, I'm in college, like my life is just hectic, and then if I take a half an hour, 45 minutes out of my day just to go for a walk, whether it's on the beach or whether it's going through some scenic kind of route, it just feels so much better when I come home. I feel almost as if I've kind of have a weight lifted off my shoulders. So the fact that and that's, to me, that's connecting with nature, and that's kind of, like you said, like that can even be used as your own spirituality, and then to me that makes me feel so much better with myself. It makes me feel less stressed. Even like with like the likes of people now, a lot of people have anxiety, a lot of people suffer with depression, and anything that the doctor even can recommend is just go outside. Like that's what, like, plenty of people have said to me like before, like, oh, like I was always advised like to make sure you go outside, to go for a walk, to get out, to be active. And like, to me, that's kind of, it says a lot in itself, the fact that I can go out for a half an hour walk somewhere on the beach or a scenic route, and then feel like you have a weight lifted off your shoulders and you come back. And that's kind of what made me kind of think a place like Newgrange, it's so connected with nature, it's so connected, it's so built around the sun. It's kind of what I ask myself is that what it is that what we need in order to be happy?
It's undoubtedly part of it. I mean, if you want to get an idea of how anciently, nature played a serious part in the spiritual experience for people, Newgrange, is in lovely, lush countryside with the Boyne, which is very important to it. The Boyne River is actually very central to why Brunabonia is where it is and not somewhere else. But take, for example, Glendalough. I don't know if you've ever been, but if you go to Glendalough on any day of the year, but particularly in the summer, and you will, Glendalough, I mean, the whole area has walks up into the mountains and through the woods and along the lakes. And it's almost like when people are there, they're getting it's like a retreat. It's like a break from the hectic life you were talking about, and you can see it in people's expressions. You can see that they've actually changed. I mean, I've been with groups. I'm a tour guide, so I've had groups there, professional people who are at home in the States and other parts of the world where they're very busy and they're stressed out, as you say, and all the rest, and they've the bills to pay and all the stresses and strains of life. And they go to Glendalough and walk around the lake or up into the mountain, and they just get lost in themselves. And it's really beautiful. It's a beautiful thing to witness. And I've seen it with my clients. I've seen people who've been transformed in the space of a few days just from walking in the Irish countryside. So that right there is an indication of how important that is. So when St. Kevin came along and was looking for somewhere to found his monastery, by God, did he choose the perfect spot. It is some of the most sublimely beautiful landscape anywhere on the planet. It's fabulous. And the great thing is you can go there now, you just park your car and you go walking and you get lost for the day. Well, not literally lost, But the other side of it is just getting slightly back to the myth. Joseph Campbell said there were 4 functions of mythology. The primary function of mythology, in his view, was to allow the human being, or to help them, to live through the experience of life with all its ups and downs, its highs and lows, with all its joys and all its tragedies, but to immerse themselves in that life. Because, you see, the story, I believe, was in part an initiatory thing in a tribal situation. Youngsters who are basically, and I have the same situation, my kids are all facing adulthood and it's full of stresses and strains. What am I going to do in university? What am I going to work at, and then all the other strains of modern life and all the peer pressures and all that stuff. And I think in prehistoric cultures, the job of the elders was to initiate the youngsters into life in a way that would prepare them in the fullest possible way. You can't prepare people for all eventualities. Some people endure horrific tragedy and some people, endure the most horrible lives. You can't prepare for that. But in a lot of scenarios, you do, as a parent with your kids, you do your best to try and prepare them so that they can handle life. I believe that's a great deal of what Campbell spoke about with regards to that function of myth is still actually very relevant. That the story is in some way gearing you up for life. And so the metaphors of the story are very important. And if you look at Catholicism and Christianity, I mean, the central figure of that mythology, which I believe Christianity is a form of mythology, is Jesus Christ. And Jesus Christ spoke to his friends and his community using parables, which are metaphors, basically. Stories designed to get you thinking, right? So he wasn't really doing anything different, except in the case of organised religion. It was saying, listen to what this man is saying. Oh, and also, obey these commandments, and if you don't, this is the punishment you're going to get. And unfortunately, the organised church, it became a powerful thing, not least through monetary means. So to be part of the church, the church became a sort of a fairly wealthy organisation, But that idea of Christ teaching in metaphors is central to the whole function of mythology, in my view. And the thing that I believe is at least partly relevant to my own work is there a way that I can resuscitate, revivify, re-energize the old Irish stories in a way that's not just Shanachie type storytelling for entertainment, where people get this nice cozy warm feeling about, oh, I'm after hearing a story from ancient Ireland, wasn't it great, and then they go home and forget about it. Is there a way in which I can bring it a little step further? In other words, is there a way that myth can help people? Campbell believed that just in the retelling of the myth, you are actually performing a very important function, and that there's this innate part of the human spirit or the human consciousness that seeks that experience, that finds just hearing the story nuministic, in the same way as the pilgrim at Glendalough will walk up into the mountains and have this powerful experience and say, people who've been working for 20 or 30 years and suddenly find they need a break and they need a holiday, and they go and find themselves and have the most and I have met such people, life-changing experiences,
And just 2 last questions for yourself.
That'll be just another hour or so.
I'm trying to think. What was the other one I had? Right, I'll ask this one next, and then I'll end it on the one that I have ended. So I presume you've obviously attended the winter solstice before.
Many times over.
What is it that makes you keep going back? And what was it that once was you went once, you saw what the crack was, you saw what happened, and then that's it, right? I don't have to go again. What is it that makes you keep going back?
Oh, well, yeah. That's a really good question. Really good question. Because I can't answer it simply. I can say that every time I've been has been different. There's a festive atmosphere on the official day of the solstice. It's a great day to be there. It's a great day to celebrate that cultural identity that you have, and to do it with the tribe, not just in your... a lot of what I do is very personal, I do it on my own, a lot of the time I spend in the landscape and at the monuments is on my own, and I love that, and I wouldn't change that. But it's also nice to meet the community, and you meet different people every time, and
so it's almost like being a part of a tribe for the morning.
That's only one aspect of it. I wouldn't want you to think that's the only reason. That's one reason. It is always a festive. It doesn't matter if it's raining or if it's foggy, or on those beautiful sunrise days when the sun is lighting up the monument. It doesn't matter. It's always a joyous occasion. Another very important reason is because I feel very close to the experience of the people who built it, because I believe that's what they did. See, you can speculate around the archaeological evidence, and my speculation would suggest that the burials probably took place coming up to the time of the solstice, or around the time of the solstice, But obviously, because the chamber is very small, the burials took place, led by a very small group of, let's call them elders, tribal elders, priests, druids, whatever you want to call them. I don't know what they would have been called. But I still believe that at solstice there was a very big gathering at Sheedenbroga, or Newgrange, to give it its modern name. A large gathering, like what you see today. So, for me, it's a lovely way to continue a very, very, very ancient tradition. And even that is lovely, because in the doing of it, without even consciously thinking about it, in just the doing of it, you've made a lovely bridging across hundreds of generations of people to a time so far back that you couldn't even begin to imagine, first of all, what the landscape actually looked like back then. Never mind the kind of lives that people were living. You can only get glimpses at it. So it's lovely to be able to make that connection. Another reason that I go is I'm a photographer, and I take photographs for my website and my books, and personally, just because I love photography, and photography is another of those things that gets you out into nature, and so I find photography is a very good spiritual activity. And every time I go, I get different types of photographs, and it's a lovely record of the place, not just the monument, the stones, the thing that it is. It's helping to bring it to life. It has a life of its own. It's spectacular like that. It gets in under your skin in a very good kind of way.
And then just the last question that I'll leave it on is, I'm trying to discover myself, discover my own spirituality through connecting with nature, through looking into Newgrange. How has Newgrange changed you? How has looking into your mythology, looking into your history changed you as a person? If you were to look at yourself from the time before you didn't have an interest, or you maybe that you still had an interest but you hadn't really delved into it.
Well, I would honestly say that it's been transformational, and that's putting it lightly. In my younger years, I was anxious, overwrought, depressed, suffered from bouts of depression, one particularly bad one. Was angry, was tense, was negative in my view of people and the world, wasn't very hopeful, wasn't very optimistic. I guess you could say I was, like you were talking earlier, you were talking about people being stressed and anxious and suffering from anxiety and finding that walking along the beach or whatever gave them relief. I mean, that's very much my story. I've become a much, much calmer, more tolerant person, much less angry, much more, I believe, loving and caring, much more optimistic despite all of the shit that's going on in the world right now. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, for a time in my life, and my mother said this to me when I was younger, she said, Anthony, you carry the weight of the world on your shoulders. It's like I wasn't just carrying my own anxieties, I was carrying everyone else's. Anybody who was in trouble or anything that was going on in the world, I put those burdens on my shoulder, like the Greek Atlas, carrying the world on his shoulders. Or actually the closest, I've only in the past couple of years I've realised that the leprechaun in Ireland comes from the god Lu, who was one of the luminaries of the Tuatha Dé Danann, and a deity with whom I identify quite a lot. No, I don't mean I worship deities, it's not like that at all. I mean the archetypes, the archetype of Lu, and his character and his manifestations and all his aspects. I identify with that. I don't mean that I pray to him or anything, just in case people, I'm not that kind of neo-pagan. But Lu took on all of the burdens of the world when the Tuatha Dé Danann went into the She underground. And the burdens he found at Ishnok, this is where the story is, at Ishnok in the centre of Ireland. The burdens were so great that he became what's called Little Stooping Lou, Lou Chroman, or Lou Chorpán, Lou Chroman is Lou Chroman is Lou of the burden, and Lou Chorpán is Little Stooping Lou, and that's where leprechaun came from. That this great god, one of the most powerful of the deities, had become so diminished by carrying the burdens of the world that he became a small, little, troublesome character who was, the leprechaun was likely to get you into trouble, and I see that in myself, in that my own anxieties and my own fears and that anger, that pent-up anger that I had, that I couldn't put my finger on, actually, psychologically, this is a whole psychoanalysis going on here, it's embarrassing, but it was my mistrust in myself, it was my anger with myself, it was my anxiety with myself, not the world, because the tendency for, and this is a human tendency, reference the work of Jung, which is he's an incredible human being, superhuman actually. You deflect as a human. The last thing you want to do is open your own can of worms and see what's inside. So what you do is you look for fault in everyone else, and I believe that's what I did for a long time. The experience of exploring the myths and exploring the monuments and exploring the landscape has been thoroughly enriching for me, thoroughly transformative, absolutely, tremendously, a very, very uplifting experience. And I'm not addicted to it, because I don't believe in the hedonism of it. It's not like taking a drug necessarily. I just believe it's good for you, I might be unique in that view, but certainly it's made me a lot happier and a lot more secure in myself, and much less anxious than I was. I started this exploration 20 years ago, 1999, just over 20 years ago, and I couldn't begin to compare myself with the Anthony Murphy of 20 years ago, because there were two very, I understand that I'm still the same person in many respects, of course, but I'm very, very different as well, and I put an awful lot of that down to the power of the landscape and the mythology. The material, you see, this is the magic of it. It is thoroughly I mean that wholeheartedly. Yeah. It is thoroughly transformative, and the nerd in me would rather, I don't watch much TV. I'd much prefer to be in my little library reading and studying and writing and doing all this than sitting watching TV that's not enriching me in any way. Yeah. And that's because I find so much enrichment in it. I think it's a great shame. Yeah. That that the topic you touched on, that we don't seem to be too interested, and that's why I think it's important that I keep doing it. Yeah, even definitely. Here's something about mythology. And I would say this, and this is going to be, I've been writing about this lately, and I need to get this out of my system. Whether we want to or not, whether we realise it or not, whether we have any consciousness of our myths or not, as a country, we Irish are actually continuing to live out those old myths.
Do you think?
I'll give you a couple of examples. When the collapse in the economy came, and it's no great surprise that there was such a crisis, because we had three, I wrote about this in my Newgrange book, we had three collapses. The economy collapsed, so money. The church was in a state of free fall. And the three things, and politics. For the first time since the formation of the Free State, Fianna Fáil was also in a state of collapse, which is incredible when you think about it. They have been involved in the formation of the majority of governments since the foundation of the state, and suddenly they were in real danger of being wiped out as a political entity. And now, what is it, more than 10 years on, it's 12 or 13 years on from the collapse, they are very much a much smaller entity than they were before. At the worst time, I believe, for Irish history, was where we lived out our mythology, was when the government of the day, in secret, without telling the people beforehand, and that's what led to the collapse of the Fianna Fáil government at the time, handed over the authority to Ireland, to the Troika. And that, to me, was the equivalent of the Tuatha Dé Danann handing over the running of the country to the Milesians. Because the Milesians came in from Spain, so they were European, and they came in, and there was battles and all the rest, and there was confrontations, and there was treaties and the whole lot. But the treaty eventually was that the Tuatha Dé Danann were going to allow the Milesians to take over Ireland, the surface land, and that the Tuatha Dé Danann themselves were going to retreat into the Sidhe, to the other world, or into the underworld, or whatever you want to call it. And another one, and this is very important, this north-south, like, we had this whole peace process. You didn't grow up with it. I grew up with the Troubles, and it was, even when you didn't live in the north, it was terrifying at times, because you just wondered, was the whole thing going to explode into a war?
Yeah. And
were we all going to be dragged into it? The division of Ireland has been there in mythology since day one. If you read Leber Gabála, which is, or as you'd call it in modern Irish, Leabhar Gabála, the Book of Invasions, almost every invasion decided to divide Ireland. And the Milesians, funny enough, decided they couldn't elect one of the brothers. There was a series of brothers. I think there were 8 brothers. They were the sons of the King of Spain. And 2 of them had been killed. They came over here and they basically let it be known that they liked the look of the place. And the Tuatha Dé Danann said that they're jealous of Ireland. They're going to try and take it from us. So they killed them. And then the other brothers came over to exact revenge for that killing. But instead of saying, let's elect a king, there was 2 of the brothers had jealousy of each other. And they decided to partition the island, north and south. One brother took the north and one took the south.
Oh my God, no way.
And at the end of the first year of their reign, the brother who ruled the north, who was Erimon, fought and killed the brother who ruled the southern portion, Eber. And only then was Ireland unified. The idea is that Ireland is unified in blood. Now, if you go back to the Easter Rising, and this is why one of the reasons, and myth does kind of play a role in this. If you go back to the Rising marked the beginning of the birth of modern Ireland, right? However, it was a bloodthirsty affair. We were born in violence. And I believe that if you're born in a violent act, you cannot be sustained. You have to kind of purge that out of your story. What we didn't realise is that we were getting rid of the Brits, but that the Roman influence was going to be as powerful as it was, that the church basically filled the vacuum in all the horrible things that they did. They basically became like another domineering, imperial force. They did.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm saying about the Milesians. It was a thing that was born out of jealousy and hatred, and then blood. There was blood spilt. I mean, I wouldn't dream of violently injuring my brothers. It's like
it doesn't cross your mind at all. It's
so they're just 2 examples of how whether we consciously
see it or
even
not.
think about it or see it or acknowledge it, we actually, the myths are still